They call it the list. And the fact that it even exists is the problem, because it's not a list of policies, a list of concerns, even a list of actions. It's a list of fails. Yeah, you heard it. A list of fails. Citizens in Hamilton have been compiling a list of council failures just to keep track of them all. And at last look, it was at 44 on this term of council. Some of them are scandals. Some of them are bad policy choices. Some of them are flat out insults to the community or terrible handling of an issue. Well, here on the OShow, we're going to dig into the list because we have to keep council to account so that as we head up to an election a year away, we all know who we're voting for or not and why. Joining me now on the OShow is Ryan Patrick Moran. He is not only the compiler of the list, but he is also, of course, a small business owner here in Hamilton and one of the co-founders of IElect. Ryan, it's great to have you on the OShow.
Great to be back.
Now, tell me how you came about writing a list of council failures, because I know you got a watch company, you have CoMotion, you've got some other things going on. Why take the time to actually itemize the failures of this term of council?
Yeah, I mean, it really came out of, I believe in the best in the city and that it is capable of a lot of great, wonderful things. I think there had been a lot of frustration with some political leadership over a long period of time. And it really kind of almost coincides with the creation of IElect, that especially during this term in particular, there's just such a slew of things that came down in 2019 that you're like, okay, wait, I need to take a step back and itemize these because we can't forget this. This is a gong show. And so, yes, took stock of 2019, which then led to taking stock of 2020, which has now led to taking stock of 2021. And yeah, when you sit back and you look at the list, which across those 3 years is 44 entries long, it's astounding. Yeah.
It is astounding. And those are 44 entries that you have observed as an engaged citizen. I'm sure others could probably add to the list from their ward-specific interactions with council.
Yeah.
But you've got enough for us to chew on here in this
Yeah.
first part, this first part of the list OShow. I also want to bring in Mary Lou Tanner. Now, Mary Lou, everybody knows that you have an excellent background in urban planning, and you've had jobs at the City of Hamilton, out in Niagara, with the City of Burlington, very senior roles. You have a lot of expertise around how municipalities should go and should work, but you're also a very engaged citizen right in your own Ward 4. Why are you so engaged in Hamilton politics to the point of being here on the OShow to talk about the list?
Well, because some of the issues, like I almost started creating a list myself, and then I saw that Ryan had created a list. So I'm like, okay, I don't need to do it. And Ryan's list is really comprehensive. But there are just things that should matter to all citizens across the city. But there's also ward-specific things that are just an absolute travesty. Like even today, Dan Jelly put some historic tweets up where the mayor rage tweeted at me because I said, you know, my neighborhood in Ward 4 has one measly, and I use the word measly, and it is 120 foot by 120 foot park. We have King's Forest Golf Course. It was closed during the start of the pandemic. They closed the Kenilworth Stairs. There was no place for a kid to go to kick a ball because we don't have decent park space. And we're not the only neighborhood in Ward 4 in those circumstances. And so looking across the city, yes, we absolutely need to all pay attention to Ryan's list. 44 items. This council hasn't even been sworn in for 3 full years. That's more than one a month on average.
Yeah.
And then you get into the ward specific stuff and you're just going, my goodness, where's the leadership?
Well, that is an excellent question. And as we go through the list, there's some themes that jump into my mind as I listen to both of you. And one of them, Mary Lou, you hit on right out of the gate. And this is my bias. I'm into communications. But when you say that the mayor rage tweeted you, an engaged citizen with an urban planning expertise, about wanting more park space, it reminds me of when I was on Hoser Trek and penned that op-ed about how Hamilton is losing out on good things. We're falling behind because of our toxic politics and because of all of these problems of leadership that we have. And the mayor took to the Facebook verse to come at me about my comments. And yet we haven't seen the mayor communicate in a timely manner on Sewergate or on the LGBTQ violent attack at Pride, or talk to homeless advocates when they are, people advocating for housing for people living in homelessness in a pandemic. So, I mean, communication to me from this council, Ryan, is one of the things that frustrates me so much, especially from the mayor's office, where pretty much that's the gig. You're one of 60 votes, but you got a pretty big bully pulpit and you can do some pretty important stuff with that. And he's just not doing it. So we'll get, I'm sure, to examples of communication as we go forward. But where do you want to start the list, Ryan? What do you think is important, to Mary Lou's point, for Hamiltonians and for those who are listening to our podcast who might not live in town or watching the show online? Where do you want them to start to understand what we're talking about here in Hamilton?
I mean, I think the biggest penultimate universal across the city, across every ward, one that's been really just, I think, mind-boggling, and everyone generally seems to agree on, whether it's the list or whether it's IElect stuff, and when we're out in the community, is the Coots sewage dump, and that's the one that seems to just dominate, and across the years is sort of the number one, and that's the shocking thing too, is that it's across the years, in the sense that even there's all these different surrounding kind of aspects and peripheral pieces to it that are, whether it's the fact that it started in 2014 and it's 24 billion liters of sewage, whether the fact that they voted to keep it under wraps in 2018 before the election that year, whether it's the revelation of it in 2019, then the voting to potentially try and go after the whistleblower, then and right up to present day, where you had Lloyd Ferguson putting forward a motion to continue to dump sewage and putting it right there officially in the minutes and publicly, and other councillors supported it. Like, I mean, even to your point about communication, there's a question, like, at what point are you not self-aware of what you guys are doing and taking a step back and saying, this doesn't look good? like where is that?
Mary Lou, are they unaware or do they not care?
I think they don't care. I truly think when we look at issues where there has been feedback from citizens, sidewalk snow clearing, for example, and the city has an engagement platform. A number of municipalities use the same platform. It's by a company called Bang the Table. What a great name. And it's Let's Talk or Engage Hamilton. And 2,000 residents responded and said, yes, increase my taxes and clear my sidewalks. And they punt it down the road. And I think one of my observations is there's a polarization that this council is imposing on issues, a binary choice of it's A or it's B. The art of politics is finding common ground and finding common ground among a range of voices on council, but also with citizens. And that latter part really is not happening. And it really is a certain core of them that are just, this is the way it is. So on sidewalk snow clearing, it's, well, 2,000 residents, that's not a big enough sample.
They don't listen to what doesn't line up with their own preferences. Is that a fair statement, or am I overgeneralizing?
No, I think in a number of circumstances, that's exactly what has happened. Sidewalk snow clearing is a very, very good example of that. And the citizens who responded gave them a gift, raise the taxes to pay for it. And it was not a significant amount of money. And they kicked the can down the road to the next council. And it's this lack of listening to the voices of citizens. You look at, or rigging the conversation. I think, that's another thing that has gone on with this council, is we're going to listen to the voices that we want to listen to, and not necessarily the broader group. Because during the early days of the pandemic, and even as we were starting to reopen a bit, the conversation was around open up the streets for businesses, particularly places like Parkdale and Kenilworth that have really, really struggled, parts of Barton Street as well. And, give them space on the streets, give them, waive the fees for pop-up patios, and let's give these businesses an opportunity to make it through this pandemic. And the answer was, we're in a pandemic. People can't be near each other. No, we need space. Let's use our streets for that space. Make sure we have safe sidewalks for people, but there are opportunities. And it was absolutely flat out rejected. And then, because a certain group that council was listening to brought it forward, it's a great idea. It's a great idea whether that group brought it forward or others brought it forward. It was the right thing to do, but it's listening to the breadth of input and not the narrow perspective of aligning with what council wants.
Yeah, and that's, I find the funny thing there too, is that the mayor's economic task force on economic recovery out of the pandemic is all wrapped up and their business is done. And yeah, it took so long to get just patios or open streets, whereas you would go to any number of communities surrounding Hamilton. Guelph, for example, had their entire core shut down in a pedestrian zone to help businesses survive. And especially as you identify in Ward 4, where there are real significant economic challenges there and real significant commercial challenges there along streets like Parkdale and Kenilworth that really desperately need a lot of help. But yeah, you weren't seeing that, let alone on thriving streets like Lock or Ottawa.
But I saw that it came out that the mayor is now considering shutting down some streets temporarily for a pedestrian corridor. My first thought was, yeah, you're a year and a half late. I mean, forget about the fact that we're years behind Europe, and I've been yelling about this on the OShow for 20 years. We're years behind, but now we're years behind other smaller towns and other big cities in Canada that knew to do that a year ago. And so and it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that they put it forward like it's some sort of a big vision thing. No, you're behind again. It's not impressive when everyone else has done it first. And Francis, a friend of ours, posted on Twitter, this pisses me off. I sent tons of examples to them a long time ago saying other communities were shutting down traffic areas in the pandemic for that sense of space and safe community gathering. So like coming out with it now, it's pathetic.
Yeah, it is. And that's, and I mean, this is during the pandemic. This is let alone just the layers that any small business needs to jump through in the city through planning and property. And that's something Mary Lou can speak to much better than me. But I mean, you're looking at economic recovery task force. How about just making it easier for businesses to just thrive in Hamilton?
Absolutely. And you know, for a typical small business owner, dealing with the city of Hamilton, dealing with any municipality is really daunting. And it really is incumbent upon council to make sure that there is an easy path for small businesses through this pandemic. And look, I am not in any way looking at the staff that work for the city of Hamilton. It's a big organization. There's a lot of layers and complexities to licensing and economic development and planning and zoning and parking and dealing with all of that. But I think one of the lessons that needs to come out of this pandemic is the more we can do to make sure that small business can do what small business does well, which is serve their customers, the better it is for our city and for our economy. And it's job creating as well, particularly, you know, in an environment where it's an employee's market. We want to make sure that we're competitive in attracting those individuals to our small businesses. I think, you know, the other thing that is really, really important coming out of the pandemic, and we haven't seen much conversation about this, is what lessons did we learn about public space, about parks, about transit, about active transportation through this pandemic? I can tell you that the Rambling Hamiltonian, who I follow on Twitter, give them a follow if you don't follow them, has a really great video that analyzes the city's entire cycling network. And when the city redid the Cannon Cycle Track a couple of years ago, they cut off East Hamilton in having safe cycling to get to the west, to get to downtown. And when you look at the maps that the Rambling Hamiltonian has in that video, you see that there's still no real connectivity. There's discrete pieces, but then you've got to ride on Barton Street, or, you know, if Cannon Street cycle track is shut down, then you're on to King Street, or you're weaving through neighborhoods. But there are pieces that just do not connect at all. And we know that the majority of cyclists are recreational cyclists like me. Like, I'm not out there on a road bike out in the country on the weekends, but I really would like to be able to cycle downtown safely. And when the city shut down the Cannon cycle track to rebuild it, they cut off our access for 2 years.
Do you think that people are going to see it itemized like this and say, well, wait a sec, that snow clearing thing still pisses me off? And Sewergate, what? They haven't even fully taken accountability for that. Like, do you think the list is going to help people, Ryan, to say, I deserve better, whatever issue it is that gets to them?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I do think there is almost a self-flagellation kind of mentality in Hamilton too, of just like, oh, the politics have always been this way, so they're always going to be this way. It's like, no, they don't have to be. We just don't have to vote for these people. And that's it. That's as easy as it gets. I mean, obviously, there's the other side of that coin of you do want a good option to be voting for in alternative. And I think that's the other item that I really like these lists to get across too, is to get people, I mean, essentially pissed off that this is happening in the city, that these are the leaders, quote unquote leaders, who are making these decisions repeatedly in some cases, and brazenly. And it's time for better leadership. So if you think that you're good, and if you think that you could do a better job, then absolutely, please step up to the plate and take these people down, because their time has come. And that's where, I mean, I think even the aspect of it just being a list, that the idea of incumbency really weighs upon people too. And that's one of the dangers. One of the big things is that, you know, you have this name recognition because you are an incumbent. So remove the intimidation and aspect of the incumbency, and just think about it like numbers. That, look, it's all there public on whether it's Wikipedia or the city website of what these people won by in each election. So, okay, there's your goal. Just now open up a spreadsheet or open up a notepad and just start taking down, you know, the votes for how many you need to get to take down that person, and go for it.
You know what? I love that. Very, you know, simple tactics, right? It's simple math, really. And we heard Mark Cripps say last time on, he was on the OShow, how frustrated he is that it really is like a 3,000 person vote that they get out every time. That gets them over the top. We had Joey Coleman say, if you can just expand the vote slightly, it can make a big difference. But it really comes down to the ground game. Now, Mary Lou, we ruminated about Ward 4 when we had Sarah Jama and Mark Cripps on the program. And I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, although obviously you would be great in council in Ward 4. I think everybody who knows you knows that. But when you look at something like ousting an incumbent, what do you think people need to do? I mean, is it possible? I mean, what would make people, to Ryan's call to action, jump in and go for it? Because I've never wanted to go for it. I like my life, right? What is it going to take for people to take up that call to action?
Well, I think it's going to take a few things. So it is going to take a compelling narrative as to why you're running. It's going to take, I think, you know, the more people look at Ryan's list and see what IElect is doing, this is keeping the 44 issues and then some in every front and center in everybody's mind. Because when I looked at the list, when it was updated in the last few days, there were things I'd forgotten that are on the list. It's like, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. And I want to add the Kenilworth traffic circle to this list as well, that little boondoggle as well. But for people who want to run, you know, it can be done. The last person who knocked off a sitting incumbent was Brenda Johnson, who knocked off Dave Mitchell. Now, Dave Mitchell had a track record of being a very bad boy. So, but even then, it was closer than it should have been. The other thing is really run it head to head. Judy Partridge barely got back last time, a couple hundred votes. And that is probably another 4 or 5 election workers volunteering on a campaign and getting out and knocking on doors. So if you are somebody who is annoyed with what you're seeing, but you're not prepared to run, step up and help somebody run. go to a campaign, talk to the candidates running in your ward, decide who you're going to get behind, and then give them your time. A winning campaign needs about 30 dedicated volunteers. You need the money, but you need the boots on the ground to go knock on the doors and talk to residents. That's how you get across the finish line.
Yeah.
And Brenda Johnson, to your example, has, I think, the biggest plurality of votes in terms of the margin of any sitting councillor. She's pretty sweet in her seat and she took out an incumbent. So I'm going to pause you both there because I love to end an episode on such a great motivator as you've both given to our audience on the podcast and the show. But also I want to do a two-parter with you on this list right now because the snow clearing. I mean, we are coming up to that. And there's just some news this week about lawsuits in other cities about snow clearing. What are we doing with that? And there was a video that came out of a city manager talking about the sprawl and meetings, advice to developers or whatever. I mean, what are we even doing talking about extending our urban boundary when we're in the middle of all this climate emergency? There's so much to talk to you about and what council is or is not doing about it. Ryan Patrick Moran, the author of The Fail List and its curator, and of course the co-founder of IElect, and Mary Lou Tanner, engaged citizen in what ward is it again, Mary Lou?
Ward 4, East Hamilton.
Thank you both so much for being on the OShow and for being the voices that Hamiltonians trust on the issues they care about, including the fail list. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you again soon.